Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Charleston for the first event on this glorious September day. Before I welcome our speakers, I have to do a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you could just take a moment to notice the position of the emergency exit, which is basically the door on your left and my right over there. And in the event of emergency, which could be anything from fire to cattle stampeding, please just obey the instructions of one of our stewards who will be dressed in a very fetching neon jacket. As we're on a dairy farm, we have a house rule that only the cows and the milking machine are allowed to interrupt proceedings. So if there is a sudden sort of low hum that starts up during the course of the event, that means that the cows are being milked. And I apologize for that. They are literally 10 yards behind that wall. But please do turn off your mobile phones if you have them on at the moment. And now I'm very delighted to be welcoming our distinguished and truly international trio of writers, D.W. Wilson, Dave Wilson here on my immediate right, Roshi Fernando at the end, and Eleanor Dimmock. Have I got it? Dimott, in the middle. Can't get that in my head. I'm just going to say a little bit about each of them. Dave was born and raised in British Columbia. He studied creative writing at the University of Victoria. He has a doctorate in creative writing from the University of East Anglia, and his stories have appeared in literary magazines around the world, and his collection of short stories, Once You Break a Knuckle, includes the 2011 award-winning BBC national short story, The Dead Roads. Roshi was born and brought up in London to Sri Lankan parents. She has a doctorate in creative writing from the University of Swansea. In 2009, she won the Impress Prize for New Writers for her composite novel, Homesick, a series of interlinked short stories about a community of Sri Lankan immigrants in London. And her work has been shortlisted for the Sunday Times EFG Private Bank Award and longlisted for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Prize. And Eleanor, in the middle, was born in Zambia, educated in the USA and England, spent parts of her childhood in Southeast Asia. She read English at Oxford, qualified as a lawyer, then became a law reporter. Eleanor plays jazz flute and says that she tried to write her debut novel, Every Contact Leaves a Trace, which was published to rave reviews earlier this year, as if she was improvising a solo. And she's also a writer of short fiction, which has been published in Strand, the Warwick Review, and Algebra. So in terms of the format for the event, each author is going to read for between 15 and 20 minutes, and then there will be the opportunity for questions. And the order that we've agreed is that Eleanor's going to go first, followed by Roshi, and then David. So please join me in welcoming all three speakers. Thank you.
I'm reading from a story in my book called Test. I'm going to sing, just so you know. Again, yeah. Okay, I won't explain. Test. Sometimes at night, Rohan forgot to breathe. Since Victor died, heart palpitations would come upon him as he finally let go into the first moments of sleep, and he would startle awake like a fat man with an apnea. He lay there, holding his left pulse with his right forefingers, chanting the cardiac cycle, diastole, atrial systole, ventricular systole, diastole. That word, diastole, became a mantra, meaningless on its own, but a word to calm him, make the racing beats stop within him. Rationally, he knew it was Victor's death that caused it. At breakfast, chewing oatmeal and fresh fruit, drinking green tea, he knew there were no outside influences, nothing to make this happen, but fear of death, but the freefall of no longer having his father in the world. It never occurred to him that the death could mean freedom, that it could mean claiming for himself a life that no one would judge. Diastole, atrial systole, ventricular systole, diastole, he whispered at night, trying to hold a human heart, trying to stop the skipping, the flailing about of the air coming in, going out. Yes, trying to hold a human heart. He was at the Oval for a cricket match with Carl. He had driven into London from the airport the night before in a hire car. He had been late, and Deirdre had hardly spoken as she handed Carl's things to him in a neat little case. They had slept late in a double bed together in a hotel, he and this strange, nearly 7-year-old creature who at some point in the night had pushed his back against Rohan's back, and Rohan had remained awake, worried, frightened even of waking him, of causing an emotional explosion. The child was his, was used to the idea of him offhandedly calling him Dad in the car on the way to the ground. He was his. In the car, Carl had said, "So, do you understand cricket?" "Yeah, I understand it. Do you?" "Of course, Papa told me." Papa was Victor, and Rohan had a pang of jealousy for the relationship that had been dependent on his absence. "Have you seen a match before?" he asked the boy. "Only on telly. It's boring when it goes on all day." And then he looked out of the window at the cars. He began to sing-song the colour of the cars, shouting green if there was a green car. Other colours were almost whispered. How to understand this, Rohan wondered. "When are they coming on?" "Not yet." He looked up at the sky. Still, "Look, the sun's come out, Carl. That's good." "What'll we do?" "Nothing." They sat still. Rohan looked about him. There were a few Sri Lankans below them in dark-coloured jackets, a couple of royal blue T-shirts between them. No one he would know. He was out of touch with his parents' friends. At his father's funeral, there had been very few people he recognised. "Should we go and get a hot chocolate for you?" "No," Carl said. Rohan remained where he was. Carl stared steadily ahead. "After Papa's funeral, you said that we would have fun," he said. Rohan looked at him. "I need some tea. Come," Rohan said. They climbed down from the high terrace where they'd been sitting and joined the queue for the drinks van. He had left when Carl was 2 and had gone to New York, being sucked into his work and his friendships, the parties, the human stories of his patients, the everyday routines of running in Central Park and drinking in Manhattan bars that he expected Samantha or Carrie or Miranda or Charlotte to walk into any day and put their arms about his shoulders and show him how to come out and be their new celibate gay best friend. Deirdre had remained in England, living on his earnings quite happily, bringing up their son to hate Rohan, he imagined, and to speak like a South Londoner. He was taxied between his grandparents, Shamini on the one hand supporting her daughter in her project of depending on and reviling her son-in-law in equal measure, and Nandini and Victor spoiling him and loving him and recognising their son in him in a myriad of ways, except the most worrying way. He just wasn't like Rohan was at the same age, and that made them love Carl even more. Rohan realised that the giving up of things was the key to living a good and safe life. He'd been a vegan now for 2 years. Alcohol was a problem, so he gave it up. He was too reliant on coffee, and that too went. Sex had gone years ago. He was now 41. He was closed down, shut down, his whole body aesthetic and pure. He was thin, yes, but good-looking thin, not anorexic thin. At bars, he was still hit on. He liked to flirt. It just didn't go anywhere. It was the key to living, this giving up of things. To be tested all the time meant that you learnt about yourself every day, that you understood yourself anew. Yes, he had slips, spectacular ones sometimes. When his sister called to say his father had died, he'd just come out of theatre after performing a very straightforward valve replacement. He remembered the time before she called so clearly. He had gone straight to a bar with his friend and regular anaesthetist, Noah, and they had got trashed. Noah drank beer with tequila chasers. Rohan had stuck to red wine, nearly 1 bottle. He was thin and it didn't take much. And then they'd hailed a cab, gone home to his apartment and fallen into bed together. Noah held him as he cried. That was all. The slip was the alcohol. Noah was there the next morning, and when they'd drunk 3 or 4 cups of coffee to clear their heads, Noah had said goodbye and gently kissed him on the cheek. It was nothing. But after, Rohan had been left with real and passionate yearning, not just for Noah, but for love itself. Or maybe it was just for Noah. They were friends. It was now exactly a year since Rohan's father had died. In that year, he had steadily distanced himself from Noah, and Noah had taken the hint. In theatre, they were a formidable team, Rohan performing the PAVRs with Noah clowning about in the prep room, playing music, telling jokes and talking about sport, teasing nurses, generally being a perfect foil to Rohan. And yet, when they happened to be alone, in an elevator or in the scrub room, they said nothing. It was fine, though. It was a tender silence. At the cricket match, Rohan thought of Noah as he looked at his child, and the tenderness of everything in Noah made him suddenly ache for the man. Noah was olive-skinned, pale-eyed, were they green or hazel, dark-haired, always stubble-chinned. He had wiry forearms, something that Rohan continued to turn his gaze away from. He and Carl had brought their drinks back to their seats. The stadium had begun to fill up. The pitch looked white, and the two teams were now in the outfield throwing balls to one another. "Who's that?" Carl said, pointing to one of the Sri Lankan squad. "Well, I wouldn't really know, Carl." "Well, why don't you look?" "At what?" "The program. They have numbers on their backs. It'll tell you in the program." "Oh." He looked. "That's Sanath Jayasuriya. You can just say Sanath. That's what Papa called him." "Okay." "Or you can just say their surnames. That's what people on the radio say." "Okay." The child watched for a while, sipping at the soft drink. "Mum says I'm not allowed Coke because it makes me hyper." "Okay." "Do you miss Papa? Don't say okay again, okay?" Yeah, I do miss Papa. Do you?" An announcement. The Sri Lankans had won the toss and were batting first. "Did you hear that, Carl? Sri Lanka's batting first." "Yes. I miss Papa. It's all girls now, Mum and the two grandmas. I call them that because they really are." Rohan laughed. "What would you have called me if I was a girl?" "We would have called you Smelly because we wanted a boy." Carl looked at him with narrowed eyes. "What other names were you going to call me?" "I wanted to call you Carl with a K." "Ooh," the child was animated. "You see, I wanted to be called Carl with a K. I think that would be so cool." They watched the batsmen take their places and the fielders shout to each other. "When you operate on people, do you cut right down the middle and tear them apart with your bare hands? I mean," and he turned to Rohan, placing the half-finished drink precariously on the side of the seat and pushed his hands on Rohan's chest. "Do you take their ribs and pull them apart one by one, like plink, 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 plink?" And he pulled at Rohan's T-shirt like he was playing the harp, one finger and then the next. Rohan laughed, taking the boy's hands and kissing them. He saw Carl wipe the backs of his hands down his sides. "Do you want me to explain how I operate on people?" The boy had turned back to the game, but he nodded. "I use needles and catheters, which are a type of tube, and I push them through people's skin. And using tiny cameras down the tubes, I can see where I'm going, like I'm a tiny mole going down tunnels in the woods." But he didn't think the child was listening, so he stopped. The first batsman took a run, and they clapped. "We're going to win," Carl said. Carl said, "How are we doing?" "Let's see. Sanath is on 118, Sangakkara on 28. We're doing great, Carl." "Okay," shouted Carl loudly. "Okay," Rohan said. He was fiddling with his phone. No signal, no message. Below them, the England fans were getting rowdy. A man in the middle with a tall white and red hat started to shout, sing, "Everywhere we go," and the crowd answered, "Everywhere we go. People want to know," the man sang. "People want to know," the crowd answered, "where we come from, where we come from." They sang out, and as they sang, voices echoed from across the ground. The man stood on his chair and shouted to all of them, "We are the England, we are the England, the mighty, mighty England, the mighty, mighty England." And on this line, Rohan joined in, standing up with the others in the row. Carl pulled at his shirt. "Sit down, sit, that's not us, that's not us." He was becoming upset. Rohan laughed down at him, and as the song waned, he clapped with the others around him. The family in front also clapped, and the mother waving her Sri Lankan flag. "It's just a little fun, Carl," Rohan said. "But we support Sri Lanka," he said, and he was near tears. "But we're for England too, darling," Rohan said. "We're for both of them, mate. We're for everyone." He realised then the child was his, not his father's, not Deirdre's alone. Loving him wasn't enough. He had to take this child on, take him and remould him and try and straighten him out. He put his arm around the boy. "Want to play questions again?" "All right. I'll start, shall I?" The boy nodded, but at that moment Jayasuriya was out. A roar went up and Carl jumped. "Oh dear," Rohan said. "It's okay, son. There's more batsmen where he came from." "I'll ask questions," the boy said. "Can I come and live with you?" "Yes, of course. Do you want to?" "No." "Do you live in a house or a flat?" "An apartment, we call it in New York." Can we live in Sri Lanka? Papa told me about Sri Lanka. No, I won't ever live in Sri Lanka, but maybe when you're grown you can. Will I ever have a brother? I don't know. Will Mum get married again, do you think? She might marry Phil. Who's Phil? Her boyfriend. This made Rohan fill with warmth and gladness. Do you kiss boys or girls? Rohan looked at his son. He did not want to know what Carl had been told. He kissed Carl's head. At the moment, I kissed this boy. The answer was accepted. Sangakkara hit 2 4s. Rohan stood to clap, and Carl stood too. The girls in front held up their 4 cards. The younger ones stooped and picked up a spare card and turned and handed it to Carl. He waved it in the air. We are the England, the Barmy Army sang below them, and Carl and Rohan joined in. When they sat down again, Carl said, Can you teach me to dance? And Rohan said, Yes.
Can anyone hear me okay? I'm not used to being up this early on a Saturday without a hangover. So this is sediment from my short story collection. In the last weeks of the school year, the hallways empty out, and summer gets so close you can taste it like iron in your throat. Invermere, the whole town, maybe all of BC, is suddenly the eye of a desert storm. The wind kicks dust down the main hall, but there's not a soul, not a tumbleweed, only this feeling in your gut that you're shooting on through. My days blur into report cards and administration and the occasional phone call to a student's mom. Ceremonies, grad pranks, a party in some teacher's backyard with a bonfire big as a motorhome. It's euphoria. It's like a thing earned, and the hours swelter by without worry over recompense. But you never quite move on from what you've left behind. At night, on my porch, I eat grapefruit wedges and think about who got me here. The air smells like the mountain wind and the citrus juice pooling on my plate. Life is a series of events between shitstorms, my dad used to say. On the porch, I'll imagine Bellows, the only guy who ever bared his teeth for me. His bob and weave walk, his messy hair, and that grin more bucktooth than lip. Then I'll remember the hick, Ham, huffing on the asphalt, his breath sticky with hops and his mouth full of blood and sand, how bad he looked after Bellows beat him pulpy. And for a moment, I lose track of myself. There's only the grapefruit and the valley wind and the questions that will haunt me through the end of days. We met at the end of grade 11 when Ham, this high school dropout with a pigskin face, caught me late for class. He pinned me to the school's stuccoed wall and waved a bony fist. This is what you get, he said, and pushed the knuckles under my nose. I was 108 pounds, and Ham had one fat arm across my chest. He stunk of chewing tobacco, wore an NWO ball cap turned 180, a button-up denim shirt. I was a teacher's boy, the kind of kid rednecks take a fancy to, and I generally spent my free time hiding behind the tungsten-colored portable in a cubby someone had hollowed in the earth. I smelled that jagged fist and imagined how bad he would beat my face with it, but then Bellows, a Jehovah's Witness with biceps big as my neck, came out of nowhere. He threw himself at Ham, this tornado of arms and grunts and spit. Afterward, he brushed dirt off my sleeve and asked if I was all right. Yeah, I told him, and thanks. Bellows was new to town, said being a JW often caused him trouble in Christian settlements like the Kootenai Valley. Settlements, he used that word, I remember. He had dog brown hair and freckles and a mole beside his nose. Having him around felt like having a police escort. His family had moved to the valley from Manitoba, where his dad worked as a mechanic for a JW community outside Winnipeg. Bellows claimed to not touch alcohol, and he was forbidden from eating ketchup or having sex out of wedlock, but rumors said he and a girl named Charlie tried it in the back door. He had one green eye, but the other was colorless gray. His dad could refute the theory of evolution. I once saw him curl a 100-pound dumbbell in each arm, and that made him the stuff of legend, like a figure from the WWF. We killed time together at lunch hour in a walled-off courtyard accessible by a door marked staff only. The stucco was Algae green with a shin-level strip of sandstone brickwork. Bellows only ate peanut butter sandwiches and a grapefruit, quartered, and he always offered me one of those wedges, and I always accepted. For the first time in 4 high school years, the Hicks hesitated to pick on me, and for the first time he could remember, Bellows had a friend who didn't care that he was a JW. I showed him the dirty hollow I used to hide in, and he collapsed it with 2 great guillotine stomps. He read me a couple of verses from his Bible. We hiked Invermere's main hall, and he bristled whenever we passed somebody who might cause trouble. A couple times, he thought somebody was making a move and went stiff, his pupils dilating and his heart a thump like a kid in love. At the end of May, Bellows found an ad in a newspaper selling a '67 Camaro, so we drove to a town called Edgewater to have a look. When we got there, the car was on cinder blocks outside a mobile home. Cobalt blue, darker than the desert sky, rust-peppered tinwork. Bellows lowered a palm to the frame like worship. He lifted the hood to stare at the V8. When he blew across the engine, dust coiled into the air, thick with the smell of carbide. We tried the doorbell, but all we got was a Rottweiler's blood howl, so deep and throaty it left you scratching your chest for an itch. A few days later, Bellows took me to his garage and perched amid the clutter and the freezers full of elk meat was that beautiful Camaro. My project, he told me. Summer got into full swing. Beach parties, valediction, a gathering at the gravel pits where guys shotgun cans of Hurricane beer like it was coming into style. Me and Bellows spent so much time in his garage that we missed the big happenings around the valley. Some kid wandered out of the gully at the edge of town. A retired high school teacher signed up for the MMA tough guy tournament and shattered a student's nose. Us, we tinkered the Camaro. Bellows flung me tools and crooned instructions, and for the first time in a really long time, I thought life was going all right. At home, my old man asked me what the hell I'd been getting up to, and I just told him, tweaking that car, Dad. And he looked at me and said, "Is that all?" The whole time, Ham drove loser laps along Invermere's main hall, and we saw him with a puck slut riding shotgun, a giant decal on his tailgate that said, "You are too slow." In July, Bellows fired up the Camaro for its virgin run. His dad helped us with the guts, but when we repainted the body, Bellows made it a point of being just me and him. Afterward, the Cobalt drew the eye like an athlete. We cruised around in that beater on the rise. Bellows pushed a Queen album in the tape deck, and we blared Fat Bottom Girls. People gave us looks. At the only red light in town, we sidled up beside some hicks in a raised pickup. Their bass drowned ours, but Bellows gave them the eye. They called us fags, and he revved the engine. Then the light greened, and Bellows dropped the clutch straight to second, and I made a paddling motion out passenger as we shot on by. Near the end of the summer, me and Bellows swung by the lake, just bombing around, desperate to scrub up some excitement. On the way, we bumped into his friend Charlie, wandering home with a bottle of Crown Royal. She crammed between us, athletic, brown-haired, with nice teeth and a smile that showed her molars. At the lake, Bellows parked the Camaro under a street lamp, and we hiked with Charlie to the water to circulate the booze. We sat on the sand with our shoes off, dipped our feet in the water. "How much that car cost you?" Charlie said. She gave Bellows a look, a once-over. I'd have traded anything to be in his shoes. "About $2,000 so far?" "You ever wonder?" she said, but didn't elaborate. She tapped her feet against Bellows. Their knees brushed. The water swam with sediment. I had Bellows' shoulder wedged against mine, but I thought I could smell Charlie, that scent of citrus fruit. I'd have given anything to switch places with Bellows. Charlie dangled the Crown Royal between her thighs. "I can't drive stick," she said. "It's just timing," Bellows said. "You could show me." "Yeah," he said, "if the time's right." But he never closed the deal. Charlie offered him more whiskey, but he had to drive. Out of courtesy, she offered me some too, and I tried to taste her lips in the bottle. Then we heard boys yell and tires screech, and when we looked at the Camaro, there was Ham's truck and a bunch of guys scrambling out of it. Bellows straightened. I caught Charlie's eye, and I could see that she wished I were not there. Bellows took off in a sprint. By the time he reached the parking lot, the Hicks had scratched "fucking fag" across the Camaro's hood with a key. Ham was halfway inside his truck when Bellows heaved him to the asphalt and kicked him in the ribs, hard. He grabbed Ham's hair in one fist and cracked him in the nose, and cracked him again and again. Other hicks climbed from their truck, but one glare from Bellows made them wait it out. The whole time, Ham blubbered like a kid being beaten. He was saying sorry. He was saying he was so sorry. When Bellows finished, Ham's face was puffy, as if by bee stings. He went fetal. Bellows had blood and snot on his knuckles and teeth marks in the bone, and one hand had swelled to the size of a 10-ounce boxing glove. Call someone, he told me. Bellows? I said. Call someone, he said again, this look in his eyes as if he meant, help me. Bellows' parents didn't take well to the news. In a few days, his dad made plans for him to hash out his last school year in Manitoba at that community for JWs. It was August. Town slowed to a drift. Summer jobs ended, and kids hit the streets to meander their dwindling freedom. Me and Bellows did what small-town boys do. We got shit-faced on cheap vodka and pinged rocks off coal trains. We made half-hearted attempts to score girls. In the dirty hours of the morning, with the sun cresting the Rocky Mountains, we traipsed down the street and discussed anything except the fact of our parting. In 4 months, I'd be in the thick of my grad year, and Bellows would join the Canadian Forces, take his knuckles overseas to the sand-blasted Afghanistan dunes. There, some iron shrapnel would open his throat like a quartered grapefruit, and he'd see God as things go blue. I'd graduate at the top of my class. On the evening of the convocation, Bellows' old man would show up and pat us all on the shoulders. I'm still not sure why he came. To look for ghosts, maybe, or to hang on to something. At the end of the night, he caught my arm and hissed, "You were everything to him." A decade later, I need a new electrical panel, and the electrician turned out to be Ham, clean-shaven and ready to make a name for himself. "Whoever would have thought," he'd say to me. But that's summer for you, or that's summer for me. These nights are short, and some evenings I sleep and wake and dream here on this porch until the sun lifts over the mountains. Bellows was the only guy who ever bared his teeth for me. Even my dad, rest him, never had the stones. When night recedes and the dawn turns cobalt, I shuffle inside and put music on to make it sound like there's somebody home. I pour myself a drink. There are probably a few things left unsaid between me and Bellows, but that ship, as my dad used to say, has run aground. This is how me and him say goodbye. On the eve of his departure, we climb into the Camaro and blaze around the gravel pits with the headlamps dark, and we bawl and laugh and hug and skid donuts until we've kicked up so much gravel, it's like a sandstorm passing in our wake. Thank you.
We've got the chance now for some questions for our three authors, and we've got a roving microphone, someone in the back. So if you just, can we have house lights up a bit so we can actually see? And then if you put your hand up, and the mic will come to you, and you can ask a question. Any questions? Dinah at the front. Oh, the other word, third row. Yeah. Thank you.
Amazing stories. What were the starting points for each three? What was the moment where it began?
There's a starting points for each of your stories.
Test. Test started because I wanted to write a cricket story, because I thought a book that had Sri Lankans in without a cricket story would be... also, winning the Impress Prize, weirdly, rocketed me into a tiny bit of fame. It wasn't much, but I felt exposed. And I met another Bloomsbury author, and we compared notes. The same thing had happened to him. And we'd both done the same thing, which was give up meat, have many disastrous haircuts, and I had invested huge amounts in makeup, in fact. And I thought this was a very weird response to being a writer who sits at home and writes. And then I took it further, and I thought, actually, this is about the test of oneself, and veganism and all of that sort of thing. And I liked this idea of finding a place in the world by giving things up, and then anyway, so that's where the initial impetus from that.
For me, I saw a cabbage in my garden one day that had a blackbird in it, and I'll never forget that moment for the rest of my life. I can count on one hand the number of times I've been that surprised when it moved. And everything I write is to do with a dual perspective. A lot of that comes from my work as a lawyer. I never got used to the fact that things always have 3 or 4 different versions of the same story, and a case that will move through the British courts can change obviously at every stage. That case was a case that I covered in the Criminal Court of Appeal, and as with so many of those cases, they are overturned and overturned and overturned, and a fact will come along that will completely flip a story, which is something that I have always been interested in fiction anyhow. The fact that there's always, or there can be, I like the idea of looking at it as a story, as a diptych, that there can be an exact opposite of what you might think you're seeing. And those two things seemed to fit to me, and so I tried to think about what I could do with them.
It's always voice for me. So I can't move forward into a story without a voice. So in this case, it was the first sentence in the last months of the school year. The hallways empty out. The actual grain, like far back grain of the story, came from this strange tale a friend told me, where the last time that she spent with like a good friend of hers was they went out night golfing, which was they just had a bunch of golf balls and just hit them at nothing. So that was the original final line. Became the night golfing instead of driving around the gravel pits. But that was because the story, I changed to the driving and the dust and the dirt, because that became a motif throughout it. But that also, because of the voice, it's really hard for me to remember. Like I have this weird thing where I can read these stories and know they're mine, but I have actually no memory of the experiential quality of actually writing them. So like I know that like how the germs that led to them, and that I know I always start with a voice, but the actual experience of putting it into words, it's gone. So I had that night golfing thing as an end, and I had the opening line about from the future looking back, and I think my originally in a lot of my stories, when there's a moment of violence, in the versions that's in the book now have been adjusted, and so the violence happens in the reverse of how it originally did. So the violence would originally have been Bellows taking a beating from the Hicks. But I subverted that to turn it on to, because that would have been a cliche, right? So I've turned it to try and make it so that the apparent good guy becomes the bad guy, sort of, or at least casts him in a darker light. I don't know if that's an answer to the question at all, actually. But
no, it's very, very good answers to the questions. We've got another question, Diana, down here, and then anyone else put hands up as well? Yeah, and there's 2 over there after that. All right, okay, no, 2 over there, Christina, thank you.
I really wanted to ask why short stories, and the difference you find between writing a short story and writing a longer story, and different challenges. Which do you prefer? Lots of questions there. Sorry.
Should I go first? Yeah. I've written 2 or 3, I think 3 novels actually, which were all really rubbish, and I'd started writing another novel, which which just wasn't working, and I was using the characters in Homesick in this novel, and it started to become, each chapter was finishing, was whole, and it wasn't that. So I started writing a novel, and then it turned into short stories, and I realised that all I had read was short stories, and the people that I admire most write short stories. It's a unique art form. It's like writing. It's like writing a painting. You have everything contained there in that frame, but it can be anything, and that's such a freeing thing. I find it a meditative thing. I find it very easy to use the theme and then find the discordant imagery and to, you know, I just love it. I think it trains my brain. I mean, it uses my brain in an entirely different way. With a longer piece, you can put an awful lot more into that, and so that also is a freedom. You can, you know, someone can make coffee, and you can actually describe the whole of that coffee making process, which, you know, I find quite tedious when I read it. But, you know, on the other hand, that's quite a nice thing to see the whole of the person and their journey. My stories tend to show you a changing moment, I suppose, in a character's life. I thought that the short story uniquely served the purpose of what I was trying to do with Homesick, which was to present a community of people, and it turned into almost like a village type structure, and so you know, each person is represented there, and then it's part of this greater community. And then, you know, I have been accused in a review quite recently of, you know, rounding it off too neatly. You know, at the beginning there is a party where all of the people are at the party, and at the end there is a funeral, and all of, you know, and the remainder of the people through the stories are at the funeral. They gather again. But in some senses, that you know, in life, in reality, my reality has been more twee than that. You know, the stories are always there. Sri Lankans tell great stories, and there are a lot of funerals now rather than weddings, but there were a lot of parties when I was a kid, and they were like that. And I just thought, you know, short stories were great. It just helped to represent that community perfectly.
I'm really preoccupied at the moment by scale in writing, and in terms of your question about difference between long and short. And I have a friend who's a photographer who showed me recently an enlarger that she uses. She does a lot of developing photographs directly onto a wall with something she calls liquid light that she paints onto the wall that replaces the paper and then projects the image from the enlarger onto the wall. And she was showing me the enlarger going up and down, and I thought that's a really nice, for me, way of thinking. I'm struggling at the moment with a novel that I'm writing. Obviously, one day I'll write one that I don't struggle with at all, but this one is real struggle. And this and finding that really useful, the enlarger going up and down on the head of this machine, as a way of thinking of zoning in or zoning out, or what you can. And in terms of stories, there are so many different ways to write a short story, as many as there are ways to skin a cat. And you can a really, really small story. Like one of Virginia Woolf's lamps in a line or something can be with that enlarger right up close. Or you can, I think, I suppose I tend to think more in terms of where am I going to put that focus, or how far back am I going to stand when I start. And I guess with a really, really short story, I'm going to stand in the same place all the way through. With a longer one, I'll take a walk and come back and having looked at the view from somewhere else.
That question comes up a lot when you read short stories out. It's why have you chosen short story? Why short story? What can a short story do that a novel can't? And recently, just at Cork, Nathan Englander, who just won the Frank O'Connor for his short story collection, said he asked, why do we insist on comparing two things that are not in conflict? Which I don't quite agree with him. But I think it's interesting that it's always there's this implicit framing that I've chosen short stories instead of novel, and that's sort of like the short story is vying for space that the novel has, which I guess in the publishing world right now it sort of is. I wrote Once You Break a Knuckle during my undergrad in Victoria, University of Victoria, on the west coast of Canada, because we wrote short stories instead of essays, effectively. So I produced like a ton of short stories, like 80 of them, and I picked 12 of them from Once You Break a Knuckle over the course of 5 years. I think that they're two completely different art forms, the novel and the short story, and I just finished the next draft of my novel. It comes out next year, and I don't think I thought to myself, I've been working on this novel for like 3 years, and I thought, I can't wait to get back to the short story. It's gonna be so easy. It's gonna be. I had this like memory of like just blasting off short stories, like just like one and then all the time. I finished the novel, put it aside, gave myself a week, sat down, thought this was gonna be great, and I couldn't do anything. I completely forgotten how to write everything. A sentence at a sentence level, I couldn't. And then the structure, like a short story, maybe because it's you've got this limited envelope of not rules but conventions that you can't really, like you can push and you can play with, but if you break them, the whole thing will kind of unravel. It's kind of like a balloon skin that you can expand it and you can maleate it. Is that a word? Maleate? You can play with it there, and with a novel you don't have that balloon skin. The novel can do anything, so it can just go anywhere. And I prefer the short story. See, again, this conflict thing that comes up whenever we talk about it. I prefer writing short stories. I like working within limitation and pushing that limitation in whatever way. It's like mathematics in a way. Like you have this strain, these rules, and you can achieve things within those rules. It's elegant. And I think we can stop there because I'm just rambling.
Okay, we've got another question at the end of that row, have we? Was another hand up, or no? No? Yeah. No? Yeah, there's a question there. Okay.
I'm interested in your international background that you all share, and I'm curious about to what degree you think you can be successful in conveying the essence of one culture to completely another culture, so that you can convey small town Canada or Sri Lankan family mores to a Western, to an English culture in this case, and whether it comes across or whether something is kind of irretrievably lost in translation.
Who wants to go first with that one?
I'll take it. I think if it was actually translated, I think that you'd stand the risk of losing a nuance in the actual language and in just the actual like voicing of the words. I think you lose it in translation a little bit. As far as I'm not trying to portray, like, my goal is not to say, lo, here is small town Canada. I'm working, like, the stories are like, they work with universal themes, like loneliness, emotional disconnection, like the bond between fathers and sons, and these kind of things, and those are themes that are human, and they're not necessarily cultural. There's some of the language in the vernacular that I use and the colloquialisms. Sure, an English audience probably won't get them all, but as long as like the personality of it, or what's the better word, like that like you can convey a meaning without being completely accurate, and as long as that comes through, so that the themes of loneliness, and then that kind of like the sense that you get when you read about a kid who loses his best friend. Like we all can relate to that. It doesn't matter if you're Sri Lankan, English, Canadian, American, Japanese. It doesn't matter. And as long as that's my goal. And I'm not too concerned. Like, I'm not even accurate half the time. Like I make up language sometimes. Like I use a line when a sick stick needs to hit the ice in one of the sentences. And which is supposed to be like a Canadian sentence. And my Canadian friends are like, what the fuck does that mean? Right? And I'm like, but it doesn't matter because they understand the context that it's set in. And so that it's, even though the actual, whatever that means, I was talking about Ponegoli in hockey and whatever. But as long as that sense of desperation, which is what it's supposed to imply, comes through, then I have achieved my goal. So it comes down, I can infinitely relate everything back to voice. So I think it comes down to a voice, and a voice that is authentic and intimate, because that's the second most way we identify people, is their voice after faces. And as long as that comes through, that sense of intimacy and trust and authenticity in the voice, as long as that comes through, then I don't care who's reading it or what I've conveyed.
I just have one tiny contribution, not writing from either of those perspectives, but I did find it really interesting. I read a story by Hemingway last week, Up in Michigan. I was thinking about that afterwards and thinking, yeah, it's the up that makes that. I mean, obviously the rest of the story is incredible, but that title, it could have been In Michigan, it could have been, there's the fact he puts that up there, that's his place, that's his, and he really owns that story. And I was really curious afterwards as to what quite about it had such an impact, and that was, I thought, an amazing colloquial, as you say, that authenticity just straight in there, Up in Michigan.
I agree with Dave about the universal themes. I feel like a bit of a fraud, really, because I born, brought up in England, British as far as I'm concerned, and then of course when I started to write, all this Sri Lankan stuff came through because that's what I grew up with, and there are smatterings of Singha in there, and there's food and there's, singing. But I was serving the characters. I was trying to portray characters, and I was trying to portray individual people who just happened to be from that particular community. And I do sort of feel that that culture has meant that I can sell the book on that kind of level. And I think the publishers have been quite canny in that. But I think it's a very British book, funnily enough. Although it has that smattering of Sri Lankan-ness all the way through. And actually that question goes to the heart of who I am, in the sense of, are you international? I don't think I am, but other people see me as such. It's quite strange, actually.
Thank you. We've got time for probably two more questions. We've got two more questions. One there and one there. Fantastic.
Same row again. I was really struck by, I thought that in each of the three stories that the actual characters, our perception of the different characters were changed during that short story in different ways. Either we became sympathetic, less sympathetic, judgmental, etc. And I wondered if you felt that was a particular characteristic of the short stories when you felt that to write it, that was giving it a greater depth within a short story, or that you were just merely reflecting the complexity of human beings?
I think the latter for me. I think I was just reflecting his individual complexity. I don't necessarily write knowing what the reader's reaction will be, to be honest with you, because I think that would be a mad thing to do, because everyone individually will react to someone who is latently gay or whatever else, It was an interesting question, actually, because you know what? I hadn't thought that he had changed that much through the story, but of course he had, yeah. Sorry, come on.
Talk about Hemingway again, just because I'm spending most of my time at the moment reading his stories. And it makes me think as well that the idea of there being this well, we were talking about this before we came in today, the idea of there being some kind of an orthodoxy, or is happily not something that I find restricting, in that that there are just so many different ways you can do it, and so many of his very, very short stories that he writes very early on are really only one thing happens. One I read this morning, a guy is taken outside and shot, and that's all that happens. Nothing changes in terms of the character, but for me, reading it at that moment, something changed.
It's actually, I can get boring and very crafty for a second here. In the short story, the climactic moment, you don't have enough physical space. You don't have enough pages to countenance something that's really, really dramatic. Otherwise, it'll come off as melodrama if you try, basically. If it had turned out that he actually had killed his wife, that would have been like a ooh, right? So nice save. I was a little worried. So you just don't have enough. You don't have enough room in a short story because you need to. It's like the cliche thing in a writing workshop is you tell your students, don't write about abortions and don't write about murders, right? Because those are the two things that they always try to write about. They think drama, fiction. When in fact what you need, that's why the short stories don't have set pieces. They don't have big dramatic battle scenes like Cloud Atlas, David Mitchell is just a series of set pieces one after the other. Right? And short stories can't handle that because they don't have enough room in it. Of course, there's going to be someone's going to yell about this one. I'm going to put my head down. Shame. But in general, what the short story relies upon is that moment of epiphany, that where a character is presented with the opportunity to change. He doesn't have to take it, or she doesn't have to take it, but it has to be presented with an opportunity to change. And so that's what you're picking up on is that's the epiphanal moment. Epiphany. That's the moment of epiphany. That where the character either changes or doesn't, right? Or where our perception of him changes or her changes because of not taking that possibility. That's I think what you're picking up on. It happens in novels too. It happens over such a long scale that I think you may not pick it up as it's like by the time you hit the end, you think you've always thought this about that character when you've probably just slowly been adjusting your perception of them all the way through. Because a sudden change in a novel would also be melodramatic. If a character went from being like a very like heinous killer to like a saint, you'd be like, wait, what? There has to be gradation of that all the way through. So that's one perhaps crafty difference of that a short story and novel thing. So in opposition again every time, can't talk about them without being like, well, this and this. Anyway, I'm gonna rant and.
Very good. And the final question here.
That's good.
I enjoyed all your stories, very, very different and distinct as they are, and also hearing you talk about what touched or moved you to write them. What I was wondering, though, was whether in any way the process of writing the stories maybe in some way cured you of some homesickness that you might have had for time and place that you depict.
Totally, for me, writing is a massively healthy way of shaping. I moved country often growing up, often every 18 months or so. Never stayed anywhere for very long. There were periods of time where I had absolutely no idea who anybody was, apart from my immediate family. And it's something that it's a job, and I love it, and it's something which it's something I'm always learning. But there is this other angle to it on a very personal level, which is that every time I sit down to write a story or a chapter of a novel, it's a way of giving some structure to not that I write autobiographically, but that I just the actual process of writing a story and shaping a story and creating something in the same way that I get with my music is just a kind of a giving a form to experience, which is something that I very definitely didn't experience growing up.
Giving form to experience, that's a really nice way of putting it. It didn't cure me of homesickness, because I think if you grow up an immigrant, you grow up with difference. And when I grew up, I was born in the 60s and grew up in the 70s, and there was still quite a lot of racism and quite a lot of knowing that you were different and that you weren't as good. You're always questioning whether you are as good, actually, and you're always wondering where the place is that you belong, and then you make it. You know, you make a family and you make it yourself, and you become a better person by achieving educationally, or, I don't know, my sister is some big banker and she just earns this huge amount of money, and even that seems not to give her that place in the world, you know. I think my family and my sisters and I are always searching to be as good as everyone else. It's and that's just my own hang-up. When we had the lunch for the publication of this book, I was so lucky. Radio 4 Extra read some of the stories out, and we were talking about childhood things, and I was saying about how I had my hair cut as Purdy from the New Avengers, and I was never allowed to play her in the playground because I was brown. And all the people at the lunch went, oh, and I said, yeah, but then I had all my award-winning stories read out on the radio, so but so it's not really cured my homesickness, but I've now become quite arrogant.
Well, I first off, I grew up in the Kootenay Valley, which is in the middle of nowhere in Canada. It's like 14 hours east of Vancouver by car. Are there any Canadians here? Any Canucks? Anyone ever been to Canada? Yes. But I studied on the West Coast, as far west as you can go in the University of Victoria. And all the stories are set in the valley where I grew up. So I was in Canada when I wrote the stories anyway, all except for one, I think. And I find this, I can't write about where I am. So when I was in Vic, I wrote about Invermere. And now that I'm in where I am now in England, where am I? It's Saturday. I should be hungover. Now that I can't. I've tried to write a story about Victoria, and I'm like marginally happy with it, but I still end up going back to Invermere, even though I don't no longer consider Invermere my home, because my family left there, and I got a couple of friends left. I just don't go there when I go back, right? But that said, I am massively homesick. I haven't been home in like a year and a bit, so I'm like really missing Canada right now. So it doesn't really cure it, but I try to like engage it, because I know I write about sad men. That's just laid out, right? I write about men who are sad about things. So that's what I do. And so and I'm pretty happy right now. So I used to be quite miserable, and so I'm finding them having a hard time. I channel it. We had this thing called the Sad Man Club. I've been kicked out. I'm no longer allowed in. So I try to channel it a bit, and so like what I did a few nights ago. I have keep in mind, I'm really missing the Canada West Coast. Haven't been there in a while. I went down to sit down to write. I thought I'm going to listen to a Canadian band. So I put on like this band that nobody would know. I'm not going to say it. And I was listening to it. And I was like, yeah, that's good. They're singing about Alberta. I'm like, great. I don't mind Alberta. It's not BC, but it's not bad. And then I got like distracted by Wikipedia, as one does, right? And I started like checking. I'm just going to see Wikipedia of Canada. So then I just checked it out. Read about some like epic things my country has done. It's not that epic, right? They're kind of epic. And then I ended up just on YouTube watching Molson Canadian beer commercials and like tearing up, like feeling like I miss Canada so much. And then I went to bed without doing anything. It was a complete fail. But yeah, so I don't know. I need that sense of homesickness in order to write it, but I don't know if it cures it. I clearly not, I guess.
Well, that's a great place to end sad men and homesickness. I just want to thank our panel for 3 fantastic readings, one great musical interlude, which we really enjoyed, and some great insights into, and some very generous insights into the writing of short stories. So I really want to thank all 3 speakers so much for participating in this event. You've got the chance to carry on the conversation at the bookstall at the back. You've got the chance to also buy their wonderful books, which please I urge you to do. But please join me now in thanking all of them for making a great start to Small Wonder today. Thank you very much.
Wow.